video, we looked at which things are not happiness, which things are thought to be happiness by many people, but which actually do not constitute true happiness. In this video, we're going to be looking at what is happiness. That is, what things actually do constitute true happiness, according to Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. Especially important as source texts for this video are the Nicomachean Ethics written by Aristotle, Book 1, chapters 7 through 13, and Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, first part, question 12, question 26, and the first part of the second part, or Prima Secundae, questions 2 and 4. All of these are source texts for what we cover in this video. Now, as we saw before, happiness can be divided into the notion of happiness, or the abstract idea of happiness on the one hand, and on the other hand, the concrete reality in which happiness is realized. This is similar to thinking about the word food. On the one hand, we might mean the notion of food, or the abstract idea of something being food. This is what you desire when you are hungry. And on the other hand, the concrete reality in which food is realized in your house. This might mean an apple, banana, or blueberries. That is, those concrete realities which verify or realize the notion of food. Now, it might be the case that you're hungry and so you desire food according to the abstract notion of food, but you are disgusted by the idea of eating an apple, banana, or blueberry. So you are inclined towards eating food, but you're not inclined towards eating the concrete reality in which food is verified within your own house. Likewise, we necessarily desire happiness in the abstract. That's because our will is the appetite which corresponds to what the intellect apprehends as good. So whatever the intellect apprehends under the general notion of good or happiness is something that the will is necessarily going to be inclined towards, insofar as it falls under that aspect of happiness or the good in general. On the other hand, the will is not necessarily inclined towards the concrete reality in which true happiness is realized, or the concrete reality in which happiness is found. That's because the intellect might not always recognize what that concrete reality is in which happiness is actually found or realized. And so, insofar as the will only follows what the intellect apprehends as good, and the intellect might not know where happiness is truly realized, the will not always incline towards true happiness, even if it always inclines towards the abstract notion of happiness. Now, there are several things that people often mistakenly confuse for the concrete reality in which happiness is realized. These include wealth, honor, fame or glory, power. Here we specifically mean political power or administrative power, health or beauty, pleasure, and even the virtues. People often think that these things are what constitute happiness. That is, they think that these things are the concrete reality in which happiness is realized. But, as we saw in another video, these things are not happiness. They're not that concrete reality in which happiness is truly realized. But if none of these good things is that in which happiness is realized concretely, then what is that thing in which happiness is realized concretely? That's what we're going to be discussing in this video. We'll begin our answer to this question by looking at how Aristotle answered the question. Now, Aristotle was a Greek philosopher living before Christianity by about 300 to 400 years. Aristotle answered this question purely using natural reason, that is, what we can investigate by human philosophizing. On the other hand, St. Thomas Aquinas, as we'll see later, who was living in the 13th century, long after Christianity and long after Aristotle, while accepting Aristotle's answer, supplemented it with the things which were known by Christian revelation, that is, the revelation which was the foundation for Christian doctrine. So St. Thomas Aquinas agrees with Aristotle, but he also supplements Aristotle with certain theological considerations. Aristotle, in contrast, is reasoning about happiness merely from human reason or philosophy, not revealed theology. Now, Aristotle begins his answer by describing the abstract notion of happiness. Later on, he'll address the concrete reality in which happiness is realized. But first, he has to figure out what happiness is in the abstract. Now, he says there are 3 notes in the idea of happiness. The first of these is that happiness is the last end, that is, the ultimate goal of human action. Now, good, in general, means the end for the sake of which something is done. That's just what it means for something to be good. It must be an end for the sake of which something is good and done. Now, every art or discipline has some good, which is the reason for the activity of that art. For instance, the good of the cobbler is to make shoes, of the builder to make buildings, and of the conductor to make a symphony. So these things are the good for the sake of which these artists practice their art. But that for the sake of which everything is done is called happiness. Therefore, happiness is the last end, or the ultimate goal of all human action. The second note of happiness is that happiness is a complete, that is, perfect good. Some goods are only means. For instance, taking foul-tasting medicine is merely a means. You only take disgusting medicine because it's useful. You don't do it for its own sake. Now, other goods are sought both for their own sake and for the sake of something else. For instance, honor and pleasure are sought for their own sake, but also because they're useful. Now, there's a third class of things, which is what happiness falls into, which is sought only for its own sake, not for the sake of anything further. Thus, happiness is called a perfect good without qualification. Here, perfect just means complete, that is, lacking nothing. It's something sought for its own sake and not for the sake of some further supplementation. The third note of happiness is that happiness is the self-sufficient good. Self-sufficient goods are those which, when isolated, make life desirable and lacking in nothing. This can't be just one good among others, since if it were, you could always add some further good and make life even better. Therefore, what came before would have been lacking in something, not lacking in nothing. Happiness, in contrast, is lacking in nothing, so you can't just add another good to it and make it better. Happiness, being the self-sufficient good, cannot be supplemented in any way by an additional good. But if that's the case, then happiness cannot be viewed as just one good among others. Rather, it must be something general to which any particular good cannot make any addition whatsoever. So, in summary, the idea of happiness, that is, the abstract notion of happiness, is that of a good which is 1, the last end or ultimate goal of all human action, 2, the complete or perfect good, something sought for its own sake and not for the sake of something else, and 3, finally, the self-sufficient good, that is, something which other goods cannot make an addition to. It's not just one good among many. So these 3 notes constitute the abstract idea of happiness. Now, in what possible concrete reality might this lofty idea be found? The first thing to note when we consider the concrete reality in which happiness is found is this: the good of anything with a function or proper activity is precisely that activity itself. A mere principle for doing something, such as the power of the soul or habit or virtue, which are both principles of action, not actions themselves, cannot be the last end, since these are ordered to something further, namely the activity itself. Powers are ordered towards that activity for which they are a power. So too, habits and virtues, which are perfections of powers, are inclined or directed towards the activity which they perfect the power with respect to. So, to make this more concrete, the power of sight is ordered to the activity of seeing. Likewise, the power of intellect is ordered towards the activity of knowing. Likewise, the virtue or habit which perfects the intellect, the habit, for instance, of scientific knowledge, is ordered to the actual consideration of scientific facts or scientific natures. So we don't just stop with the power or the habit or virtue, rather we are inclined to proceed onwards to the final act, that is, the activity corresponding to the power or virtue or habit. So the good of anything with a function or proper activity is that activity. This is the last end for that thing, not the power itself from which the activity flows. But what precisely is the proper function or activity of a human? So if happiness is the last end, or the good of a human, what is the proper function or activity corresponding to a human? Now, we might say that the activity is life, or vital activity. But this is a function or activity shared in common with all living things, not just humans. All living things have vital activities of some sort. So let's get more specific. Perhaps we'll say that sensation, or sentient life, is the function or activity that is the perfection of a human, the good towards which a human is directed. Again, this is not specific enough because this function is shared in common with even brute animals, that is, irrational animals. So this cannot be the proper function of a human. It is certainly one of the functions that humans do, but it's not the proper function. How about reason? Here we've finally reached the proper function or activity of a human. This is what is specific to humans, the activity which is not common to all living things or to all animals, but rather is specific or proper to humans. This is the proper activity of a human. It's that by which we specifically differentiate humans from irrational animals and living things like trees and bushes. But we've said that the good of anything with a function or proper activity is that activity, since that is the last end or the fulfillment of their being. And likewise, we've said that the proper activity of a human is reason. So we must conclude that human happiness consists in the activity of reason. So here we've found the concrete reality in which happiness is realized, namely the activity of reason. On the last slide, we concluded that human happiness consists in the activity of reason, that is, the life of reason, or the life of the mind. This, however, is not a complete description of human happiness. We need to say more. Now, the first qualification that Aristotle makes is this: any sort of thing, and a good version of that thing, will share in common the same proper function or operation. So, for instance, a watch and a good watch have the same proper activity, namely telling time. The way in which a watch in general and a good watch differ from one another is in the fact that the good watch tells time well, and the watch in general is compatible with telling time in a poor way, or telling time in a way that is inaccurate or imprecise. So we have to distinguish between a good human and humans in general. Humans in general and a good human will have the same proper function, namely the life of reason or the life of the mind, but they will differ in how this activity is done. Any human, and a specifically good human, will share in common the activity of reason. Any human and a specifically good human differ in the way in which they perform the activity of reason, namely well or ill. Now, virtue is the principle by which a power of the soul is perfected so that it performs the activity to which it is directed well. Therefore, happiness is not merely the activity of reason, but the activity of reason done according to virtue. That is, done in a good way. So, human happiness consists in the life of reason, that is, the activity of reason, in accordance with virtue. So it's not just the life of reason, but the life of reason in accordance with virtue. The well-done life of reason. This, however, does not complete the description of human happiness. More needs to be said. The second qualification that Aristotle adds is this: one warm day or the arrival of one summer bird does not mean it is already summer. So too, one virtuous activity does not constitute happiness. Rather, happiness consists in the activity of reason according to virtue over the course of a complete life. Before a life is complete, it is yet possible for some terrible misfortune to occur to a person such that we would no longer say they were happy. For instance, their family may be killed in a tragic accident, or they may be kidnapped and tortured. Those who suffer these turns of fortune, even if they had a good life beforehand, are clearly not happy. So this is Aristotle's final definition of that in which happiness concretely consists. Happiness is the activity of reason according to virtue over the course of a complete life. We need these three factors. It's the activity of reason, it's according to virtue, not just any activity of reason, but only that activity of reason that's according to virtue, or well done. And finally, it's over the course of a complete life. It's not one good act of reason, but a good act of reason practiced habitually over the course of a complete life. So on the last slide, we concluded that happiness is the complete virtuous life of reason, but there are two activities found in reason. The activity of practical reason is directed towards ordering external actions. Here we might take as our archetype Alexander the Great ordering his giant empire. That is a life lived according to practical reason. On the other hand, there's the activity of speculative reason, which is directed towards knowledge for its own sake, not knowledge for the sake of governing external activities. Here we have as our archetype Socrates, who lived entirely for the sake of knowledge, not for the sake of governing any great empire. Practical reason gives rise to the active life, that is, a life where one habitually practices practical reason. Speculative reason gives rise to the contemplative life. In the contemplative life, what is habitually practiced foremost is the activity of speculative reason, not practical reason. The highest form of the active life, or life of practical reason, is the good political ruler. Lower forms of this life include the lives of soldiers, farmers, or business people. All of these people aim primarily at certain external activities or goods. The political ruler is chief among these because he aims at the common good of the entire nation, whereas soldiers, farmers, and business people have certain particular goods over which they are concerned. The highest form of the contemplative life, in contrast, is the life of the philosopher before Christianity, and after Christianity, the life of the theologian friar or the cloistered nun or monk. These people live their life not for the sake of governing any political affairs or any external good, but primarily for the sake of acquiring knowledge. Those in active life participate in the contemplative life whenever they read a good book, attend a good play, or participate in public worship. So it's not the case that the political ruler, the soldier, the farmer, or the business person is entirely divorced from the contemplative life. Rather, they have a component of the contemplative life within their own lives, but their life is still primarily directed towards external goods. even if at certain points in their life is directed towards knowledge for its own sake, such as when they read a good book, go to a good play, or participate in public worship. Now, speculative reason is superior to practical reason, and the contemplative life is superior to the active life. Both forms of life are good, but one of them is better. This can be seen for two reasons. The first reason is that the contemplative life has a higher object. At the highest end of the contemplative life, one acquires knowledge of nature, or the natural world, and of God, whereas the political life is ordered towards knowledge of political affairs so that they may be governed. So, since political affairs are individual matters of fact, whereas nature and God are principles over those matters of fact and of a higher nature, it follows that the contemplative life is higher than the active life. It embraces a higher form of knowledge because it is of a higher object. Similarly, the contemplative life is more certain than the active life. Since the contemplative life aims at knowledge of God and nature, or the natural world, and these things are unchangeable, contemplative life has a degree of certainty that is not found in the active life. The active life has to concern itself with the changeable human affairs which are trying to be governed. For instance, you have to know certain matters of fact in order to run a country or to run a good business. But in all of these cases in which one has to know about matters of fact, there's a high degree of educated guessing. It's not the case that we have absolute certainty about very many things at all in the political life or the life of business. And so the active life has a lower degree of certainty than the contemplative life. So for these two reasons, even when we have a perfectly happy political ruler and a perfectly happy philosopher or theologian, friar or nun or monk, we still say that the one who's living the contemplative life is happier. So there are two forms of human happiness. There's the happiness of the active life and the happiness of the contemplative life. Both of these can be called the complete virtuous life of reason. Nevertheless, one of these forms of happiness is even happier, and that is the happiness of the philosopher, the theologian, friar, or the cloistered nun or monk. After defining happiness and apparently making it look quite lofty, Aristotle starts to bring up certain defects in human happiness, certain things which make it seem like it's not quite perfect. The natural activity of reason, whether practical or speculative, depends on certain external goods of fortune and bodily goods. For the physical exercise of reason, you need certain external goods of fortune and bodily goods. For instance, if you are too hungry or too sleep deprived or frequently sick, you cannot exercise reason well. Likewise, if you're either abjectly poor or even have too much money, you will be so busy either trying to survive or trying to manage your money that you won't have time for reasoning. Likewise, not only for the physical exercise of reason, but also for the tranquil communal environment without which one cannot progress in the life of reason, you again need certain external goods of fortune and bodily goods. Your children, through their own free choice, despite all you have done, may become wicked people. Although you have always been virtuous, people may defame you and ruin your reputation. All of these goods on which the undisturbed life of reason depends can, in principle, be lost or seriously impeded by bad fortune. That's something entirely out of your control. So, the happiness that consists in the natural life of reason is never so perfect that it is entirely free from the fear that some change in fortune may take it away. Certainly, the future is obscure to us, says Aristotle, while happiness, we claim, is an end and something in every way final. If so, we shall call blessed those among living men in whom these conditions are and are to be fulfilled. But blessed men. Here, in this quotation, Aristotle is telling us that when we defined happiness just before, what we were defining is the happiness of a man, not the happiness of something like a god. What Aristotle is saying is that although we say that this happiness is a perfect or complete life, it's a life lived according to virtue, nevertheless, we should not expect it to be so perfect that it's without any fear that it could be taken away through misfortune. So when we look at human happiness, we will say that it's a perfect good, but it's not so perfect that it's entirely without any fear of disturbance. Based on this consideration given to us by Aristotle, we could distinguish between perfect and imperfect happiness. Now, earlier we saw the abstract notion of happiness is that of the final, perfect, or complete, and self-sufficient good. So you might think that it's paradoxical to distinguish between perfect and imperfect happiness. After all, it's in the very notion of happiness that it must be perfect. But Aristotle has just warned us that the sort of happiness we look for in human life is merely a human happiness, a human perfect good. So it's not so perfect that it's entirely without any fear of deficiency. So we shouldn't expect the perfect good of a human to be the perfect good of a god. One of these is more perfect, even if both can, in a sense, be called perfect. The concrete reality in which happiness is found in humans is in this activity is the life of reason according to virtue over the course of a complete life. So this was the definition of the perfect good for humans, or happiness for humans, given by Aristotle. Again, we don't expect this to be so perfect that it's entirely without any sort of defect or imaginable improvement. It's merely as perfect as it can get for a human. But this concrete reality only imperfectly realizes the abstract notion of happiness, which calls for a absolutely perfect good, not just something that's perfect with respect to humans. Here are some of the many defects contained within human happiness. As we just saw, it depends on the goods of fortune or bodily goods, the loss of which must always be feared to some extent. Moreover, even with the best fortune, the activity of reason is not continuous in humans, but must constantly be interrupted by sleep and other activities. So, although we might say that the happiness of a human is perfect, it's perfect with respect to a human, it's not as perfect as we can imagine in our wildest fantasies. On the other hand, the concrete reality in which happiness is perfectly found, in an absolute sense, is in God, since, as Aquinas has shown earlier in the Summa Theologiae, specifically in the prima pars, or first part of the Summa, God, as creator of all things, contains necessarily within himself all that is desirable in creation, but in a more unified and perfect way. Therefore, God has all that can possibly be desired within himself without dependence on anything else and without any fear of losing what he has, since he has it necessarily as part of his essence. So here we see two concrete realities in which happiness is realized. It's realized in humans in an imperfect way. This is called imperfect happiness. And it's realized in God in a perfect way, an absolutely perfect way. And this is called perfect happiness. Both forms of happiness are, in a sense, perfect goods, but the happiness of a human is perfect with respect to what's actually possible for humans on a natural level, whereas what's the perfect good for God, the happiness of God, is perfect in an absolute sense, not just with respect to any one kind of thing like a human, what's possible for that kind of thing, but rather it's what's absolutely possible. It's the most perfect good absolutely possible, not the most perfect good that a human can reasonably expect. So we have two concrete realizations of the abstract notion of happiness, but one of these is perfect happiness, one of these imperfect happiness. So there are two concrete kinds of happiness, as we just saw. Human happiness, which is the activity of reason according to virtue over the course of a complete life. This only imperfectly realizes the abstract notion of happiness. And on the other hand, divine happiness, which is God himself. According to Aristotle in the 12th book of the Metaphysics, God's very being is his own perfect activity of contemplating himself. God isn't something that has thoughts, rather, he is himself his own thought of thinking and enjoying himself. As Aristotle puts it, God is thought thinking himself. So, God is his own happiness. He's not even someone to whom happiness happens or comes, as in the case of humans, where happiness is something that accrues to them as something outside of their nature. God simply is his own happiness, his own beatitude. That's because he is his own activity of reason, thinking himself the most perfect object of reason. Now, divine happiness, unlike human happiness, perfectly realizes the abstract notion of happiness. It is the last end, not only of one particular thing, but of everything that exists, including God himself. In other words, God is the ultimate end of the entire universe. Likewise, God's happiness is perfect inasmuch as God, when his nature is correctly understood, is sought only for his own sake and not for the sake of any good that might add to the goodness of God. Since all goods are from God, no particular good can add anything to God's own goodness. Finally, God's happiness is self-sufficient, inasmuch as there is no good outside of God which adds anything to his goodness, since all goods come from him. So, God's happiness, or divine happiness, perfectly realizes the abstract notion of happiness we described earlier. As we saw earlier, Aristotle says that when we call humans happy, we expect only the happiness proper to humans, not the happiness of a god. At this point, we've seen three things. First, we've seen Aristotle's description of happiness in the abstract. That is, what is the very notion of happiness? Ignoring for the moment the concrete reality in which this notion might be realized. Secondly, we saw Aristotle's description of where human happiness is concretely realized. Thirdly, we saw him distinguish between the sort of happiness we would expect for a human and the sort of happiness we expect for a god. As we saw, human happiness is imperfect in the sense that it's as perfect as we can expect for a human, but it's not as perfect as we can imagine. It's not absolutely perfect. Now let's bring in St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, as we said, was living in the 13th century, long after Aristotle, whereas Aristotle was living before Christian philosophy. Thomas Aquinas agrees with the pre-Christian philosopher Aristotle that there are two concrete ways in which happiness is realized. One, human happiness, and two, divine happiness. St. Thomas also agrees with Aristotle that assuming only what we can know by natural reason, we should never expect humans to achieve divine happiness. That would be impossible by their own power. Humans, by natural reason, can reason from natural things to the existence of God, and this process of reasoning is part of what constitutes the high point of human happiness. Nevertheless, by natural reason, humans cannot come to know what God is. They cannot know the essence or nature of God in himself, since this utterly transcends the capacity of any creature to know, and constitutes the proper activity of divine happiness, not human happiness. So, the human intellectual activity is always left somewhat dissatisfied, wanting to know more than it does. But God's intellectual activity, which is his own very being, is satisfied, knowing the highest object of knowledge, that is, the essence of God, as well as all that is possible to know in one simple activity, that is, the activity of his own being. Now, if that's all St. Thomas said about happiness, then he wouldn't have added anything to what Aristotle had already said. But St. Thomas did add to what Aristotle had already said. That's because Aristotle was relying entirely on pre-Christian philosophy, whereas St. Thomas Aquinas was bringing in certain things known only through revealed theology. Aristotle was before the coming of Christ, who, by the miracle of the Incarnation, was one person composed of two natures, the divine nature and human nature. Christ was both God and man. According to St. Thomas, following Catholic teaching, Christ, since he was God, knew the divine essence perfectly and thus had divine happiness. Moreover, as a human living in the first century and speaking to the people of Judea and Galilee, Christ promised to supernaturally reveal the divine essence to those who, before their death, kept the moral law and had faith in him as the one mediator between God and men. But the activity of knowing the divine essence is precisely the activity which constitutes the perfect realization of the abstract notion of happiness. Accordingly, there are now, after Christianity, two forms of happiness available to humans. Not just human happiness, but also divine happiness. To see this, let's break down the different forms of happiness in a more concrete way on the next slide. So Aristotle told us that there are two concrete realizations of happiness. Human happiness, which is the complete life of reason according to virtue, and divine happiness, which he discusses in Metaphysics, Book 12, which is God's activity of contemplating himself. This latter form of happiness is perfect happiness, whereas the former form of happiness is imperfect happiness. Happiness which is as perfect as humans can expect, but absolutely speaking, imperfect. But after the revelation of Jesus Christ, there are now two forms of happiness available to humans. First, there is the human happiness, which Aristotle knew humans could access. This is the sort of happiness which we can have by natural means and on the condition of having a fair amount of good luck or good fortune. This is called human happiness or imperfect happiness. On the other hand, there is a new form of happiness which Aristotle did not know was available to humans. This sort of happiness, which is a divine happiness available to humans, is by the supernatural mediation of Jesus Christ, on the condition of keeping the moral law and having faith in the God-man, Jesus Christ, as the one mediator between God and men. This form of happiness, as found in humans, is called the beatific vision, or perfect happiness, because it consists in a vision, or immediate knowledge of God in his essence. It is perfect happiness in an absolute sense, not in the sense that human happiness is something perfect. So, there are two forms of happiness available to humans: a human happiness, which was described by Aristotle, and a new form of happiness revealed by Jesus, which is called the beatific vision, or perfect happiness. This is a participation in the divine happiness had by God with respect to himself. Now that we know that there is a perfect form of happiness, we must ask whether this perfect happiness is a creature or the uncreated God. With respect to perfect happiness, Aquinas distinguishes between two things. First, there's the object in which happiness is found. In this case, it's God himself who is contemplated. And secondly, there's our participation in or attainment of that object. That is, our act of contemplating the essence of God. If by happiness we mean the first of these, namely the object, then happiness is not a creature but the uncreated God himself. On the other hand, if by happiness we mean our participation in that object, or our attainment of that object, then happiness is a creature, namely the created activity of knowing God in his essence. So, in some sense, perfect happiness is a creature, in some sense, it's not. Now, we already discussed all the things that are necessary for imperfect happiness, or human happiness, and there was quite a bit that was necessary for it. But now let's look at what's necessary for perfect happiness. Are our bodies and our friends needed for perfect happiness? As we saw earlier, they are needed for imperfect happiness. But these are not required for perfect happiness because God entirely satisfies the desire of the soul in the beatific vision, and our bodies and friends cannot add any goodness or desirability to God. So strictly speaking, they're not necessary for the perfect happiness of the soul. But Aquinas says, following the Nicene Creed, that the dead will all be resurrected at the end of time, and the bodies of the saints in heaven will, being reunited to their soul, participate in the happiness which the soul has enjoyed since the death of the body. So the body will participate in perfect happiness, but it's not strictly necessary for the perfect happiness of the soul. The same goes for friends. Friends will participate in our perfect happiness, but they're not strictly necessary for the perfect happiness of the soul. Now, are good morals, that is, a good will, needed for perfect happiness? Here the answer is different, and we have to distinguish between what's needed antecedently, that is, in a prior time, and what's needed consequently, that is, afterwards. So, antecedently, a good will is necessary for perfect happiness. That's because Christ makes the gift of the beatific vision conditional upon obedience to the moral law. So if you don't keep the moral law, the 10 Commandments, and other moral precepts, then you won't obtain the beatific vision. So a good will is needed antecedently to perfect happiness. A good will is also necessary consequently upon perfect happiness. That is, once you've obtained perfect happiness, there's no way in which you could eventually have a bad will. The reason is this. The will is the rational appetite. Therefore, it necessarily inclines towards what the intellect or reason perceives as good. But when we see God's essence immediately in the beatific vision by our intellect, there can be no possible error on the part of the intellect or reason concerning what is and is not good. But since there can be no error, the will necessarily be inclined towards what is not merely perceived as good, not merely an apparent good, but what is truly and actually good. In other words, those in heaven are necessarily morally good. They cannot, at some later point, become evil. And the fundamental reason for this is because their intellect is determinately knowing what is true and what is truly good.